how many of you here know about Project 2025? How many of you have heard that name before? Okay, so about 70% of you, most of you. So we're going to break this down into four major parts. The first part, and as I said in my prayer, this is more of like a lecture. You're not going to see me asking for hallelujahs and amens. This is more of a lecture. So we're going to first off cover or spend time defining and describing rather Project 2025 and a document that it recently published that has caused some serious concern. Not only to Seventh-day Adventists, but to people all throughout the United States. And then we're going to look at some connections, evidence for connections between President Donald Trump and Project 2025, which, as we'll see as we continue, is quite a significant point. And then we're going to get to the bulk of our discussion, which is the Sabbath labor law proposal, which is what we would call in our lingo a Sunday law. Right, this is the proposed Sunday law, and that's why we're actually focusing on this this afternoon. So, and then finally, we're going to end off with a comparison between Project 2025's Sabbath labor law proposal and the Sabbath labor law or the Sunday law that was issued, or I can't remember the word now. In the year 1888 and 89. So that may be more familiar with us. Brother Loaho has done several excellent presentations on the Sunday law movement. And so I'm sure for those of you who've come here, you're familiar with that particular Sunday law. So it's important that I say this. I am not a legal expert. There is some legal lingo that we're going to go into. But if you want legal advice, talk to Brother Justice or Elder Klubi's wife. They can give you proper legal explanations. I realized how smart you have to be to do law when I just looked at a bit of this stuff. I'm like, thank the Lord I'm a Bible teacher, right? So I'm only going to be able to touch on certain aspects. I put it into layman's terms because by law standards, I am a layman. So hopefully by God's grace, this will be clear for all of us to be able to understand. So let's start off by looking at the description of Project 2025. So you'll notice that a few of my quotes are coming from Wikipedia, and that's not because I'm a poor academic. That's just because they gave the most concise definitions. I went to several different places. I even went to Project 2025 itself, their website, but their definitions weren't quite clear and concise as I found on Wikipedia. So anyways, it says, Project 2025 is a political initiative to reshape the federal government of the United States. So for those of you who don't know, in America, you all know places like California, New York, and Texas, and all. I'm sure you've heard those names before. So Virginia and so on. These in the United States are called states. We would call them provinces. So Virginia would be like Gauteng, and California would be like Northwest, and so on. So each of those places, what we would call provinces, they each have their own government, right? So they actually govern themselves. But then there is a bigger overarching government called the federal government, which is essentially the national government. That's where Donald Trump is, and that's where J.D. Vance and all these other politicians work from. They legislate over the entire nation as a whole. Okay, so essentially the Project 2025 is an attempt to change the American government right at the level of the highest level of government, right? So they're not trying to change California's government. They're trying to change the entire country's system of government. Okay. And it says, and to consolidate executive power in favor of right-wing policies. Now, again, I need to define some of this. Have you all heard of right-wing and left-wing in politics? Right. So in America, who would be the right? Okay. Trump would love to hear you say that. Yes, I am right. So the right or the conservative side of politics would be generally considered to be the Republican Party. And then the left would be considered the Democrats, right? So, and of course you have like a spectrum of people in between. Some people more extreme on the right, some more extreme on the left. And you have people who would be called moderates, who are neither Republicans or Democrats, and so on. So they're essentially saying that they want to reshape the American government in such a way that more power is in the hands of the president to ensure that bureaucrats and other government officials who may not agree with the president, that they can't interfere with what the president wants to enact. Does that make sense? Which, as you can imagine, is quite controversial. But that's essentially what Project 2025 is seeking to do. It says the plan was published in April 2023 by the Heritage Foundation, an American conservative think tank, in anticipation of Donald Trump winning the 2024 presidential election. Okay, so the Heritage Foundation is the organization. It's essentially a group of people who come together and they think up policies and ways of ensuring that America becomes a conservative country. Does this make sense? Right? And when let's say when Donald Trump is not in office, what they are doing is they spend the next 4 years planning how to make sure that Donald Trump gets in office, and then also that he has all the executive orders and policies in place already. So that's why, did you notice that when Donald Trump got in office, he was signing these executive orders like he was just like printing money, right? It was just like coming out of nowhere. That's because of the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. Not exclusively. I don't want to go too far. He has his own policy makers, but as we're going to see in a moment, some significant members of his team are from Project 2025. So they literally gave him a whole list of policies just to sign. Right? Does this make sense? Okay. So now the part that concerns us is something called the Mandate for Leadership. Now, this is, according to the definition, a series of books published by the Heritage Foundation. As we've mentioned, they're a conservative think tank. And then it says they offer specific conservative policy recommendations designed to be implemented by the federal government. So do you remember that I said that these guys spend the next 4 years and they'll be coming up with policies? So this book, the Mandate for Leadership, is where they write all their policies down. It's essentially a policy handbook. Does that make sense? Hello? Make sense? Okay, so if they have ideas for what the president has to do in regards to education, they include it in this Mandate for Leadership, right? It means a set of instructions. That's what the word mandate means, for the leadership. That is for the governing powers, right? So this is a set of ideas and proposals for the people who will run the country. Okay. So that's what we want to. That's what we will be focusing on now for this presentation. Is this book that they published? That's actually a picture of the cover, the Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. It's a 922-page document, and if you think that's long, their original document, printed in 1981, was about 3,000 pages. So they've learned to summarize. So since 1981. Up till 2016, they had 8 of these books, like 8 different editions. In 1981, the president of the United States was a conservative, a Republican called Ronald Reagan. And there is evidence that he actually was approached by the Heritage Foundation. He came into office in 1980. A year later, they came and they proposed this book to him. I don't know how he read through 3,000 pages. Maybe his under counselors did, and they implemented about 60% of the book, right back in 1981, right? So these are policy suggestions that are put together by brilliant men. I've listened to interviews of some of these people, and they are like the creme de la creme, right? These are highly intelligent, highly educated people. And then the one that we are looking at for today, as I'd mentioned before, as we read in the quote, was published in April of 2023, and this is the 9th edition, right? This is the 9th edition. It says the 9th edition in the Mandate series, Mandate for Leadership 2025, the Conservative Promise, was published in April 2023, prior to the 2024 presidential election. The 9th edition includes 30 chapters and is over 900 pages in length. This document provides the policy agenda for Project 2025, right? So that's just a summary of what we read. Now, if you go onto YouTube and you type in Project 2025, you may come across a video by a godly man called Scott Ritzimer. He's an Adventist. Some of you may know him. Lovely, lovely man. Gives very balanced presentations. And he did one on Project 2025, which is not the same Project 2025 that we are talking about. There was actually a Project 2025 which was essentially a series of predictions, as it were, made in about 1998 by scientists. And it was about, I think, like 100 or 90 predictions. And it deals with, like, there would be wars and the interest rate would be like this percentage in this year and so on and so on. So don't get confused. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about predictions of what will happen by the year 2025. That's why they called it Project 2025. They even estimated that there would be a pandemic in 2019. So I don't know if that's a prediction or an announcement. You never know these people. Okay. So what I want us to focus on now is the connection, the evidence for at least an association between Donald Trump, the President of the United States, and Project 2025. So this is taken from Forbes, a news agency, and it says, and a financial agency, it says, despite his frequent denials, many of Trump's key allies have been directly involved in producing the project, which includes this 900-page book. So that's all I'll read for this. There's a long reference because it's basically like a URL code. But do you see that in the statement that Donald Trump denied that he knows anything about Project 2025? You can go onto YouTube and you can see videos of him saying, I don't know who are these Project 25 people. He didn't even say it properly. He's like, I don't know who they are. I don't know what their ideas are about. And then later on, he's like, no, they got a bunch of crazy ideas. So he was really distancing himself from Project 2025. And some Adventists were like, phew. Okay, that's a good thing. But then the quote continues, and it says, Russell Vought, I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly, Russell Vought, who was caught on camera by some people who were pretending to be donors and sponsors. They had a meeting with him in a hotel, and they were pretending that they wanted to sponsor, I think, Project 2025, but they were lying. They were actually working for a climate change organization, and they interviewed him with having secret cameras all over the place. And some of the things that this man said were quite startling. So it says, quote, essentially summarizing this interview, and again, you can find this on YouTube for yourself. Russell Vought said in the video that his group has been working tirelessly to draft a number of plans that would block funding for Planned Parenthood, which is an agency that offers abortions, cut down on government agencies' autonomy, and work, and this is the part that particularly concerns us, to rehabilitate Christian nationalism. Right? So does anyone know what Christian nationalism is? Okay, so I need to explain myself then. You can see the word nation in there, right? Right? So Christian nationalism is the idea that Christianity should dictate how a nation runs. So in our lingo, it would be a union of church and state, right? So it's essentially the government would have an official church. It would be sponsoring the church. It would be enforcing Christian policies, including Sunday legislation. So in this interview, with his own mouth, he said, we are working to rehabilitate Christian nationalism. We want to bring America back to God. That's the expression that they use. He called himself someone who has the president's trust, and said while he expects Trump to continue to distance himself from the plan, the former president has visited and raised money for his organization. So he's like, even though Donald Trump is saying he doesn't know us, I've seen him, I've met him in person. He's come to our organization. He's actually donated and done fundraising for us. It says that he blessed it. Donald Trump blessed it. He gave it his approval and has been very supportive of what we do. So some may choose to say, well, Russell Vought's policies, or rather Russell Vought's statements, are not actually, we can't take them against Donald Trump's because we don't have any evidence for it. But again, as I said over here, it says many of Trump's key allies have been directly involved in producing the project. This man actually was recently hired to run a major section of the American government. So the likelihood that President Trump does not know about Project 2025 is very minimal. And he's been to the Heritage Foundation many, many times. There's lots of pictures that you can see of President Trump there. So in any case, yeah. So it's quite possible that the president was distancing himself because he knew that there would be a lot of bad media if he was connected with this group. Okay, now this is where you really need to concentrate. This is where we come to the controversial part of this presentation, or rather the controversial part of Project 2025's mandate for leadership. So before we read the controversial statement itself, we just have to do a bit of a recap about American law as it relates to religious liberty. Okay? So in America, you have what's called the Constitution. That is essentially the highest form of law in the United States. And then there were some people when the Constitution was created in the 1700s, they weren't quite happy with everything that was in the Constitution. They thought it was a bit incomplete. They thought it could be misinterpreted. So they essentially asked someone to come up with what was called the Bill of Rights. And these contain a series of statements that are called amendments, which are essentially adaptations or clarifications of the Constitution. Does that make sense? To put it as simply as I can, it's just like, okay, this is our law and this is what it means. Okay? To guarantee that you don't misuse this law. Make sense? Okay, so that's a very simplistic way of saying it. So the part of this law that concerns us is the very first amendment and the very first part of the First Amendment. It's like it's the opening line of the law, which shows you that the early Americans knew the importance of religious liberty. They knew that of all things that would be at risk in a country, the one that was had the greatest potential to be abused or ignored would be religious liberty. So they addressed that one first, and they made themselves as clear as they could. So here is the first section of the First Amendment. It says Congress, and I'll define these terms in a moment. Congress is basically government. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what shall Congress not make? A law. Okay? And what kind of law? A law that does not do what? What's the first thing it does not do? Establishes a religion. And we're going to define what that means in a moment. And what's the second thing that this law is not supposed to do? What the kind of law that they cannot make, should not make? One that prohibits the free exercise of religion. Okay? Or the practice of religion. So I went to the government website, the constitution.congress.gov. So I went to the horse's mouth. I asked the horse, what do you mean, horse? And this is essentially a summary of what you can find on their website. So when they say that they should not make a law respecting an establishment of religion, this essentially means that the government cannot make any law that establishes a state religion. In other words, they cannot say, okay, the Anglican Church or the ZCC, that's the official state religion, right? South Africa is a ZCC country, right? It cannot do that. Make sense? Now, we here in South Africa, for those of us who may be old enough or who know our history, we had such a setup here in South Africa. The NG Kerk, the Dutch Reformed Church, that was essentially the state-sanctioned church, right? So we didn't quite follow the principles of America at that time, although there wasn't really religious persecution, but maybe in some cases there was, but for the most part there wasn't. But in America, you can't do that. You can't have the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church or the Adventist Church, any church. No church can become the official state-sanctioned church. The second thing that this website clarifies is that when it says that the law cannot establish a religion, it means that it can't sponsor or financially support the religion, and it cannot become actively involved in religious activity. Right? So this does not mean that let's say when they swear in the president and he takes an oath, that doesn't mean that he cannot put his hand on the Bible. That doesn't mean that they can't open Congress with a prayer. You know, that's something that's like a lot more generic, right? It's not pointing out anything particular. It's not establishing anything over anything else. It's in reality, it's just more custom and tradition than anything else. But is this clear? right? So the government cannot pick a church as its favorite. It cannot financially support that church or the church's schools. That is not allowed by American law. Does that make sense? Okay, one religion cannot be favored over another. Now, the next part, the next phrase says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, that is, of religion. So Congress, the government, cannot make a law that limits people believing what they want to believe, right? The government cannot force people to believe in Christianity, or it cannot force them to believe in Adventism or Judaism or Islam or whatever. They have to stay completely away with that. They're not trying to promote any religion whatsoever. Make sense? Then they are not allowed to make a law that prohibits people from expressing their beliefs in words. Are you with me? So what can the government not do? It cannot, in America, it cannot control your speech. Do you know, in America, I found this quite interesting. Do you know how far they go with that law, the law governing free speech? You are even allowed to have racial slurs. You can use the K word or the N word or the whatever word, all the racial terms that we know here in South Africa. Here in South Africa, you would get in trouble, but in America, you're allowed to say it. And if someone comes and beats you up, the police have to come and protect you, even though you were the one being a racist. Now, they don't promote racism, but what they're protecting, according to this law, is freedom of expression. And here's the basic idea is this. If they say you cannot use offensive speech like racist speech, the question is, who defines what is offensive? Do you understand? Because then someone who's homosexual can say to a pastor, you are offending me for saying that my lifestyle is a sin. Do you understand? And so essentially, everybody's speech will be silenced. The moment you ban offensive speech, it's so subjective that everything will be banned. Make sense? What they do limit, according to American law, is incitement of violence. So in other words, if I don't just say I hate black people, but if I say let's go and kill those black people in the village, then the police can intervene. Make sense? And the other thing that, according to American law, is illegal is defamation of character, which is essentially when you go around and you spread lies about someone and you tarnish their reputation, because that can affect their legal status. It can affect their business and profits and all these kinds of things. So they take that very, very seriously. Is this clear to you? So again, the government, bringing this back to religion, says that the law says that the government cannot create a law which bans you from expressing your religious beliefs, however offensive it may be, unless you are calling for child sacrifice to appease your gods. Then the government can say, okay, you can believe that in your head, but you can't say that with your lips, because you're gonna cause the death of children, right? And that is illegal according to the law of the land. Do you understand? Okay. So, and of course, related to that is the government cannot make a rule which bans me from expressing my religious belief in my behavior. So church attendance, not eating pork, and so on and so on. But again, if my religious behavior causes harm to someone else, then they can step in. Okay? Because remember, as I mentioned yesterday in the Q&A, according to Romans 13, and we'll look at this again tomorrow, but according to Romans 13, the state has the right and the duty to uphold the last 6 commandments, right? Because what is that? That's protecting its citizens from murder, from theft, from all the other crimes you can imagine, right? But the first 4, it can't touch that, right? It does not have the right. That's not its jurisdiction. That's conscience, right? Who you choose to worship and honor and so on. But the moment your religious belief causes one of those last 6 to be violated, for you to harm someone or to take their property, like your gods tell you you need to go and steal someone's Mercedes Benz, then the government will be like, I'm sorry, my brother, you can believe that in your mind all you want, but you cannot act out that behavior. Make sense? Okay. All right. Now here's the statement. Are you ready? Okay. It says Sabbath rest. God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, and until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate, that is the command of God to keep the Sabbath holy. The Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. So what is this saying? This is saying not too long ago, countries where Christianity and Judaism was like the main religion in that area, it was very common for the country to enforce Sabbath rest as a matter of law. You had to, whether you were religious or not, right? That was the norm. And even in the United States, before the 1800s, the United States had laws where people had to go to church. Even the first president of the United States, George Washington, one day he was riding on a horse. I can't remember where he was going, but he was riding on a horse from one town to another, and there were guards that were set up, and they stopped him. They didn't know who he was, and they said, "Excuse me, sir, it's the Sabbath. You are not allowed to be riding your horse." This is the president of their country. And he had to obey it because the laws were so strict. Now, he wasn't yet the president at that time. This was just before independence. But the point is that all over the world, governments were enforcing Sabbath observance. Now, of course, when I say Sabbath observance, what day am I actually talking about? I'm talking about Sunday, right? I'm not talking about the true Sabbath. And that's actually what he's talking about as well. Moreover, a shared day off, and I won't read this now because of time, but essentially what he goes on to say is he talks about the need of Sabbath keeping. And he's not wrong, right? There is a need for Sabbath keeping. It's good for our spirituality, our family life, our health, and so on. But I'll leave that for now for time's sake. Okay. Now, here's the really controversial part. So all he said so far was that Sabbath rest was ordained by God, and governments in the past used to enforce this law. And it is necessary for the health of our nation, for the health of our families, to keep the Sabbath. And then they say, therefore, Congress should encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. So what are they calling for here? For Congress, which is a branch of the US government, to quote unquote encourage communal rest. Now, when they say communal rest, based on this first statement, that's Sabbath rest, right? So Congress should encourage people to keep the Sabbath by doing what? By preaching the gospel to them, by giving them Bible studies. Is that what it says? It doesn't say that. What does it say? By changing or amending the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, I'll look at this in a moment, but the Fair Labor Standards Act, that's that's federal law, right? So what are they calling for? For the government to change law at the highest level of government of the country. Okay? And what is the law? What is the change that they are seeking to implement? To require that workers, when they work on the Sabbath, that they should be paid time and a half. That's called overtime, right? So in other words, if they earn $2 an hour, if it's a time and a half, you take 50% of what they earn and then you add it. So 50% of $2 is? Hey, you guys are really tired, eh? $1, right? $1. So you add $1 to $3. Now, obviously, if the person is earning several $100s, that overtime is going to come to a lot of money, right? So can you see in that they are requiring employers to pay their workers overtime when they work on Sabbath? What is that going to make the employer less likely to do? To have their workers working on Sunday, right? So this law is being presented as if it is for the benefit of the workers, but it's actually aimed at the employers, right? Now, if you look at the history, if you look at the 1888 Sunday law and also the ones that were later brought before Congress, it always came before the Education and Labor Board. It always had to do with labor laws. And you may remember, Ellen White talks about how labor unions are going to be central in the passing of the Sunday law at the end of time. Right? So this is along those lines, right? They are appealing for a change to the labor laws of the country. The rest of it says that day would default to Sunday, except where employers with a sincere religious observance of a Sabbath of a different time, and then they mention our Sabbath, the Lord's Sabbath, the true Sabbath, and then it says I'm not going to read the rest of it, but basically what they're saying is, if I am a business owner and I have 5 workers, and I believe that Sunday is the Lord's day, the Sabbath day, and I have my workers, for some strange reason, contrary to my own belief, I have them working on Sunday, then I have to pay them for overtime on Sunday. But if I'm a Sabbath-keeping Christian, or if I'm a Jew, then if I have them work on Saturday, then I have to pay them overtime. Makes sense? Okay? So, but what happens if I don't believe in either Saturday or Sunday? Well, then the default, according to this, is Sunday. Right? So what day is going to be being observed by the majority of the country? Sunday, right? Okay. I'll skip that. Okay, I won't read this quote again for the sake of time. But essentially, the idea of overtime is not foreign, right? Even here in South Africa, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act requires overtime pay, right? When your worker comes in and they work more than usual, the government requires time and a half pay. Interestingly, in our country, if you work on a Sunday or on a public holiday, you actually get double pay. So you actually get 100% increase. So quite nice, right? But the difference is that this proposal, and I see my time is flying. I really underestimated. And I spent about 2-3 days summarizing this. This is the short version, and I'm not even a quarter of the way through. Hey, Pastor Madava, next time give me 2 presentations for this one. Okay, so the difference between what the South African law, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and what this is proposing is that in South Africa, it's got nothing to do with religion. Ivana and I, the place where we stay, we're renting from 2 lawyers, and one of them is in labor law. And I said to her, is there any religion involved in this at all? And she just said, no, not at all. She was emphatic. She says, the fact that it's Sunday, that was just the day that was chosen. It's got nothing to do with religion at all. Right? Now, maybe sometime in the past it had something to do with religion, but today it's got nothing to do with religion at all. However, with this one, we saw that the opening line of this quote was, God ordained the Sabbath day as a day of rest. Can you see that this is religious from the get-go? Right from the very beginning, this is religiously motivated. The law in South Africa is completely secular. It's got nothing to do with a day being holy or not. Okay? Now, the other thing is that in proposing this law, the government is, if it were to pass such a law, it essentially would be promoting not just any religion in general, it would be promoting a particular religion. Because not every religion has the Sabbath, right? It's basically just Judaism and Christianity. So Muslims, Hindus, Baha'is, the Sikhs, all these other religions, and the non-religions, the atheists, they don't hold Sunday or Sabbath to be sacred at all, right? So can you see that this law is not taking into account all religion? It's not wanting to uplift all religion. This is specifically Christianity. Are you with me? Do you see that that's a problem in light of the law that we looked at earlier on, the amendment? The First Amendment, remember, government, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. What are they doing right here? They're seeking to have the establishment of a particular religion. Does this make sense? Now, maybe I should say this. In the days of George Washington and the founders of the U.S. nation, in the late 1700s and the 1800s, they basically weren't Hindus and atheists, and there were some, but they were a vast, vast minority. When they said making an establishment of religion, they were basically just thinking about Christianity, right? They were thinking about the Baptists and the Catholics and the Episcopalians and all the others, right? The Methodists. They weren't thinking about the Jews and the Hindus and all that. But America today is a completely different country. Are you with me? It's a completely different landscape now with a lot more diversity. So in other words, they need to be far more careful in applying this law than they were even in the days of George Washington. Because even if they don't make a particular church, like the Catholic Church or the Baptist Church, the state church, if they favor Christianity, they still are excluding a significant portion of the population. Do you see the idea? Okay. But under that, you remember we read two statements, right? There was the one that God ordained the Sabbath, and then the second statement said Congress should make a change to the law to encourage the communal rest. Do you remember that? Now, underneath that, in Project 2025's book, there's another statement still under the section of a Sabbath law, right? Or rather, Sabbath rest. There's what they call the alternative view. And to sum this up, this is basically just a milder version of the same idea. So in the US, I'm not sure about here in South Africa, but in the US, as a worker, you are protected by law. As far as I understand, let's say if I work for a bank or something like that, and they have me work on a Sabbath, I can appeal to the company, and if they don't listen, I can appeal to the courts to ensure that I keep my job and I don't have to work on the Sabbath. Right? So essentially, they have a law in the US that's called the Allowance for Religious Observance. Does that make sense? Right? So this is something that we've been talking about. Here in South Africa, it's more difficult. But in America, if you are a Sabbath keeper, a Jew or a Christian, and you don't want to work on the Sabbath there because of religious convictions, you have the law on your side. Right? But that's so essentially the second part of the Sabbath rest proposal in Project 2025 is basically just saying, instead of coming up with a penalty for employers. Okay, let me do this. I know I'm saying a lot, so let me take a step back and just restate what their first proposal was. The first proposal was, in light of the fact that God gave us the Sabbath and that the Sabbath is good for the nation, government should make a law that penalizes financially employers if they make their workers work on the Sabbath. Does that make sense? So what is it? It's a financial penalty. Okay? And it doesn't matter if your workers are Jews or Hindus or whatever. If they work on that day, you as the employer must pay time and a half. Make sense? And obviously the purpose there is to discourage that employer from having people work on the Sunday. Another thing that happens is that when a company pays overtime, what does it have to do with its sales, with its products or services? It has to increase the price. Does that make sense? So there's going to be a knock-on financial effect. The profits are going to be hit. They're going to suffer as a result of this. So if they decide to pay their workers overtime, their competitors are going to have a better time because their prices will be lower. The ones who keep the Sabbath. Does this make sense? So can you see there's a lot of pressure that's going to be put on employers if this law is passed to make sure that people do not work on the Sabbath. But of course, you'll get people who don't care about Sabbath and say, I'll work on Sunday. I don't get paid time and a half. So it's going to cause problems. But in any case, so that's the first proposal is a harsher one. It's like, if you work on Sunday, you as the employer, you must pay more. Okay? The second one is basically saying the employer doesn't have to pay anything more. It's simply saying that if the employee wants to have Sabbath off, we should be stricter in making sure that the company has to give him Sabbath off. Does that make sense? Do you see the difference? So the one is a financial penalty, and the one is basically saying, let the guy get off, right? We're not going to penalize you. Just let this man have his Sabbath off, right? If he wants it. The other one, it doesn't matter if they want it or not. This one is a softer version of it. Do you see the difference? Okay. Now, again, the underlying motive, especially behind the former proposal, is it's religious, right? It's for the observance of the Judeo-Christian Sabbath. That's the Sabbath of the Jews and Christians. Okay. Now, again, based on the First Amendment that we read about earlier when we started this section, this would be a violation of the Establishment Clause. Why? Because the government is favoring the Christian/Jewish religion over all other religions. Do you see the problem? Okay. Now, I'm again going to have to summarize this, but this you can actually watch for yourself on YouTube. You can go to a YouTube channel called The American Moment, and you just type in the name. Can you see this name over here? Jonathan Berry, right? That name, it's this guy. You should see him. So that man is the man who is responsible for writing everything that I just said. He's the author of the whole section in Project 2025's mandate that deals with the labor laws. So he's the originator of that idea, right? And as I said about the previous people, this man is brilliant. Very, very intelligent. But it's a fascinating thing to watch, because as you watch him essentially sharing about the different parts of the proposals in this section, because it deals with more than just the Sabbath, it deals with all other kinds of things. When the interviewer asks him about the Sabbath comment, the Sabbath law proposal, he suddenly gets a bit nervous, it seems. He's no longer as eloquent as he was before. So the interviewer asks and says, one of the many interesting proposals that you've laid out in the Project 2025 handbook from Heritage is stuff around the Sabbath. Where are some of the ideas, what are some of the ideas you have there? So notice, I typed out the interview. This is like word for word. Yes, so it sounds controversial, but can you see already, when someone does that, then you know there's something. Before, his words are very smooth, but now all of a sudden so it's interesting. So even though with his lips he's saying it's not controversial, he realizes that there is controversy here. So it says, yes, it sounds controversial, but in many respects it is a return to something that basically always was. Everyone ever had that. It's specifically the idea of encouraging Sabbath rest through discouraging commerce on the Sabbath. The proposal that's in our book is amending the basic federal overtime law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, to require that overtime be paid for all work done on the Sabbath. Now, can you see that one of his first arguments, now, to be fair, the guy didn't get prepared for this, so I don't want to be too hard on him, and I'm sure he's much, much smarter than I am. So I would probably lose in an argument with him face to face. But just looking at what he's saying here, this is his line of defense. This is, in other words, his justification for his proposal for Sabbath legislation. That it's a return to something that basically always was. It's something that everyone always had. Now, does that sound like good reasoning? What's the problem with that reasoning? It's saying just because it's always been this way, or it was always that way, therefore it's a good thing. How about apartheid? How about slavery? Right? How about the feudal system in Europe? Right? How about all these things? Was that just because it always was for a very, very long time? That doesn't mean it's a good thing, right? So, so one of the arguments. Let me say this. If you don't know the history of the United States, sometimes these guys will confuse you when they promote Sabbath legislation and Christian nationalism. You'll think that they have a point. Basically, they'll make arguments like, even after the Constitution, there were Sunday laws, right? And do you know that even today, there are still Sunday laws in the books of several states in the USA? But what they don't mention is that after the passing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they basically became useless. They just stayed there. It's almost like they forgot about them. It was only in the 1880s when in Tennessee, there was some zealous Sunday keepers that essentially got some Adventists and others arrested. A famous story about them being in a chain gang and so on. And maybe over in California, I remember. But it was by far the exception. So in other words, they'll say, no, there were Sunday laws on the books, right? Up until the 1940s, they were in many, many states. In Maine, they only removed the Sunday law in 1948. So you'll think like, oh, this was the way it always was. That's not accurate because they weren't implementing it. They stopped implementing it after the Constitution was passed. And then the other thing is, if he's talking about the time before the Constitution, if you lived in Virginia, you had to attend the English church, the Anglican church. You had no choice. If you didn't attend, Do you know that song, Oh, When Shall I See Jesus? Anyone know that song? Okay, so most of you don't. Okay, that song was written in prison by a man. Well, it is either written by a man in prison or someone who visited someone who was in prison for breaking the Sabbath, because he was refusing to go to church when the government told him to go to church. Right? So in many parts of the colonies before the Constitution, if you didn't go to church, you got in trouble. You couldn't be in the government unless you were a church member. You had to be a deacon or an elder in order to be a politician. Now, what kind of Christians do you think you're going to get in the church if the key to success in politics is being a Christian, a member of the church? You're going to get a whole bunch of unconverted people coming to church, right? That's exactly what happened in the days of Constantine. When Constantine passed the Sunday law, when Christianity became the state religion, in order to get anywhere in politics, anywhere in society, guess what you had to become? A Christian. So you had multitudes of pagans, unconverted pagans, getting baptized in the name of Jesus, but in their hearts they were still unconverted. And they became the elders and the deacons and the bishops so that they could become the senators and the governors and so on. You see the problem, right? So when he says it's something that basically always was, it's like, okay, well, if you're talking about in the late 1700s and the 1800s, well, they didn't implement it, so it'll be the same as it is now. But if you're talking about before the Constitution, then do you want to bring back religious persecution? Do you know what the fine was? What the penalty was? If you didn't go to church in pre-Constitution in America, constitutional America, America, the land of the free, before the Constitution in 1781, if you didn't go to church, they would send out a group of men to find you. They would go to your house. They would walk into your house without asking. If you were sleeping, they would wake you up and they would ask you, why are you not at church? And if you couldn't give them a good reason, they would give you a fine. If you couldn't pay the fine, you would go to prison. If that happened several times in a row, guess what happened? Death penalty. This is America. That's the United States of America. So they might not have had LGBTQ and they might not have had the craziness that's going on now in America, in the States, all this transgender madness and all these other things. They might not have had all of that stuff. Pornography might have been illegal. Yeah, amen to that. Abortion might have been illegal. But you also didn't have freedom to believe what you wanted to believe either. So is that really something that you want to return to? So these are the things that they don't clarify when they make these kinds of statements. So what I want to highlight is that in this discussion, this man, and by the way, where's he gone? Yeah. I want to clarify that what I'm saying now is I'm not dealing with his name is Jonathan Berry. I had another interview, or rather quotes from the book of the president of the Heritage Foundation. His name is Kevin Roberts. I mentioned Russell Vout, all these different people. There's other names that could be mentioned. What I want you to be clear about here is I'm not saying that these people are bad people. I'm not saying they're bad Christians. I'm dealing with their ideas, which I believe are incorrect. But I do believe that these men have a sincere desire to bring America back to God. They're just using the wrong method. Do you see? These men are not our enemies. These are fellow Christians. In fact, I would argue that some of these men, like Jonathan Berry, are doing more to help, for example, the unborn, to fight against abortion than our church is. In fact, they are doing way more. Our church, excuse me, brethren, is pathetic when it comes to abortion. It is shockingly pathetic. It is disgraceful where our church stands on abortion. There was a recent change in 2019 to a policy, but if you want to know more about that, I've got some evidence to show you that they were trying to sneak in abortion, certain policymakers in our hospitals back in 2019. It was disgusting. This is still God's church, but on that point, our church really needs to repent. And these people, Sunday keepers though they may be, are faithful in fighting against abortion. It was these men and women who were responsible for bringing down Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion as nationally. They didn't remove it entirely, but they nearly brought it to an entire end, far more than Seventh-day Adventists have done. So yes, this may be Babylon, this may be the false movement, this may be apostate Protestantism, but shame on us for them doing more than us. We should be the strongest advocates against abortion, the strongest advocates of religious liberty, the strongest advocates for the rights of the oppressed and the downtrodden. That we should be the leaders in this. And in some, and don't get me wrong, our church is doing marvelously on other fronts. But as I said to you, it's a bit of a sore point for me. This on the issue of abortion. My goodness, my blood boils when I think about that. It's just, let me get off that soapbox. As I said, this is God's church. This is the remnant church. But there are areas where we seriously need to repent before Jesus can truly use us as he really wants to. Because we are the apple of his eye. But before he can pour out his Spirit, we need to repent by his grace. So anyways, a point that I want to end off on, I'm going to give you this point, and then I'm going to essentially summarize the difference between the 1888 law and what they're proposing here, just so you can have an idea in your mind, and because my time is up. So you remember, what were the two things that the Constitution said the American government cannot do? Do you remember? It cannot make a law to do what? Establish a religion. What's the second thing? To prohibit the free exercise of religion, right? So in other words, it can't force people to be religious, but it also can't force people to not be religious. If I can give you a biblical illustration of this, Daniel chapter 3, that was the establishment of a religion by the state, right? You have an image, and God's people are being forced to worship that image against their conscience. That is the establishment of religion by the government. The second part, the freedom of exercise, that's Daniel chapter 6, where he was told that he could not worship he could not worship his own God. So he wasn't free to worship who he wanted to worship. Do you see the difference? So what I want to say to you is that what they are proposing is they're saying we are trying to defend the freedom for people to keep the Sabbath. So they are proposing, and I believe sincerely, they are proposing to make it easier for people to freely exercise their religion. So they're saying we're upholding the second part of the first part of the Constitution. Does that make sense? In a sense, they are. In a sense. But the problem is that they're violating the first part, the Establishment Clause. Because now they're saying the government is going to enforce a particular religion so that people who are of that religion can be free. But what about the people who are not of that religion? Do you see the problem? Okay, no, you don't. Do you see it? Yes. Okay. So in other words, and I almost had to do like a commentary on these men's statements. I had to do like a contextual analysis. For those of you who know what I'm saying, you know what I mean. I really had to analyze what this man was saying because he's smart. This guy's really smart, and I'm not. Right? So I had to analyze what this man was saying for hours. I was looking at the statement in the mandate, going to what Kevin Roberts, the president, was saying, comparing their statements, looking at American law, trying to figure out what's going on here. And I realized in order to keep one part of the Constitution, they're trying to break the other part. Do you see the problem? Okay, so just to quickly summarize, this is the man, Senator Blair. This is the man before whom A.T. Jones stood in 1888 in November, December, and he fought against the pushing or the enactment of this Sunday law. As I mentioned yesterday, they tried to enact a Sunday law several times after this, between 1888 and I think about 1906, 1910. But this man he was almost like the Donald Trump of his times. He was just signing bills, signing one order after another, and he was very popular. And so the people came to him and said, hey, we've got all these Sunday laws in our states, but no one is implementing them. And there are these people who are keeping us from keeping the Sabbath holy, meaning Sunday. And so essentially this man wrote a bill. This is the first part of it, a bill to secure to the people the enjoyment of the first day as a day of rest, and to promote its observance as a day of religious worship. So to summarize, oh, by the way, let me not say that just yet. So what I want to quickly look at is the similarities between what Senator Blair was proposing in the 1880s, which nearly brought the second coming, by the way. You know that. If this was passed, Revelation 13 would have been fulfilled, and Revelation 14 and the rest of Revelation. This is how serious this was. Ellen White actually tells us, I've got the quote where she says, if this had happened, Christ would have come very shortly afterwards. But God hindered it from happening because the church was not ready. And he used A.T. Jones to shut this bill down. But notice the similarities. Both of them, of course, are promoting Sunday observance. That's obvious, right? Both of them, interestingly, make exceptions for works of necessity or works of mercy. So they like in the Gospels, Jesus said, if your ox falls into a hole, you can bring it out, right? So you can do healing. And so they're like, yeah, people can do that. Hospitals can function and so on and so on. Both of them impose financial penalties. But the difference is that with the Blair Bill, they had fines up to $1,000 in 1888. Today, that would be $34,000, which today is 640,000 Rand. In other words, if you were a repeat offender of Sunday, you would have to get about more than 500,000 Rand as you'd have to borrow or something. I don't know. If you didn't pay it, straight to jail. Right? Didn't matter who you were going straight to jail. But of course, with the Project 2025, it's much, much milder. It's simply saying that employers have to pay overtime. They're not going to be fined. They're not going to be sent to jail unless, of course, they break the law. Then there probably could be problems. But you see, I want you to see that what's being proposed in this is not the same as was proposed in 1888. It's softer, right? But I would argue in some ways that could be more deadly because people take it less seriously. Now, the differences. The Blair Bill of 1888 banned all secular work. You couldn't even deliver the mail. In fact, that was one of their pet peeves, the mail service. They just hated the postman. Apparently, he was very bothersome for church service. I think what happened was when they were having church, that was when the postman would come by and he'd be ringing his bell and they're trying to pray and the guy's ringing his bell and mail, mail, mail. So they really didn't like the mailman. But they banned all secular work. However, Project 2025's proposal simply makes it more expensive to do business in general. Do you see the difference? In 1888, it was no work whatsoever. It's illegal. In Project 2025, it's just more expensive. Okay? Secondly, the Blair Bill bans even secular activity like going to the movies or going to a pub or doing something that's not directly religious. In other words, you either had to stay at home and do nothing or you had to go to church. Those were your two options in 1888. Project 2025, however, leaves that untouched. It doesn't say what you have to do on Sunday, except that if you work on Sunday, you have to be paid more. Do you see the difference? Again, it's milder, it's softer. Thirdly, the Blair Bill makes no allowance for Saturday Sabbath. They didn't say, if you're a Sabbath-keeping Christian or a Jew, then you can take it off. However, there's a manuscript that you can find, a transcript of the conversation between Senator Blair and A.T. Jones. And as A.T. Jones was fighting against the Sunday law, he said, okay, Mr. Jones, how about I'll give you Adventists your Sabbath as well? And then we can have our Sunday law as well. You can have a Sabbath law and we'll have a Sunday. There's no work on the weekends. And A.T. Jones says, no, it's all wrong. It's all against the Constitution. Even if it was just a seventh-day Sabbath law, I would fight you just as vigorously because it is still a violation of your jurisdiction as the state. You have no right to tell anyone what day they must worship on. Right? So he was consistent, and that's what won his argument. He was consistent all the way through. So the Blair Bill initially did not make that allowance, but the Project 2025, as we saw, does make the allowance for seventh-day Sabbath keepers. So, in summary, Project 2025 is definitely milder in its proposal. But notice, have you ever heard the expression, if you give them a toe, they'll take your leg? Have you ever heard that? You give them a little bit and they'll take much more. So what history shows us, what history shows us is that when Sunday legislation is passed, initially there's a lot of indifference to Sunday and people follow secular activity. And the whole reason these guys are passing they want to pass the Sunday law is so that people will become religious. But when they see that people are not religious, they're just like, yay, we got a day off. They're going to start pushing harder to make sure that Sunday is respected. Do you see this? So when Constantine passed the law, he said, you cannot work on Sunday. But he didn't say you have to go to church. And the bishops in Rome were like, okay, amen, hallelujah. And they were hoping that everyone was going to come to church now. But they didn't. More than half the nation stayed and they just had parties and then they got drunk and they ate a lot of pap and they were just having a good time. Right? So what happened? The churchmen were saying, Mr. Constantine, this is not good enough. We want that Sunday law to enforce the true observance of Sunday. So what started with just, you don't have to work, eventually becomes, you have to go to church. And then if you don't go to church, now you're going to get a fine. And if the fine doesn't work, eventually in the year 538, death. So in other words, if this law is implemented, it may very well set a legal precedent for a harsher kind of law later on down the line. Do you see the basic idea? If they allow this in, this little toehold for a religious legislation, one day they'll get far more than they bargained for. Are you with me? So that is part one of our presentation. Tomorrow we will begin to look at some responses that you and I as Adventists can have to what is being proposed in the United States. Because one day soon, this will be proposed in our own country. So we need to know that this is not just happening over there in Trump land. This is going to happen over here in Ramaphosa land too. And in Botswana, and in Zimbabwe, and in Romania, and in Sweden, and wherever you may be. It's coming. So we need to know our arguments, and we need to know how to prepare ourselves. So may God bless us. Thank you for your time. Should I pray? Yes, okay, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this time that you've given to us. Please help us to become intelligent in our faith, to know the reasons why we stand for the principles that we do. Help us, Lord, to be ready with answers, and help us to be ready in character for what is soon to come upon this world. In Jesus' precious name, amen.